Is it easier to win a national title at LSU or at Notre Dame? It was a question that was brought up on several ESPN shows. What was that prompted by, and my thoughts on it? We'll get into that. Plus, LSU baseball with a huge sweep over Mississippi State, who was hot that weekend, and whatever you had to miss over the weekend involving LSU sports. All of that and more on today's edition of Locked on LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Spotify, whether that's Apple Podcasts. If you're on the go, you can listen on your phone, on whatever you like to listen on. But if you're just hanging out and you want to watch the video portion of the podcast, then make sure to subscribe to our YouTube page, Locked on LSU. You'll get notified as soon as the podcasts drop. You can also follow me on Twitter at Caroline Fenton1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked on LSU as well. On both accounts, I'll post podcast updates, LSU updates, my thoughts on things. But I am Caroline Fenton, and I am your host, as I am every day. I'm an LSU graduate. I am a diehard LSU fan of all things purple and gold, and I'm now a sports talk radio host in Nashville, Tennessee for ESPN 1025 The Game. I cover the NFL, the NHL, college football, all of that, everything involving sports. That's what I do here in Nashville. But first and foremost, like I said, there was a conversation. I turned on ESPN the other morning, and the discussion was, is it easier to win a national title at LSU or at Notre Dame? And I think that that question is incredibly flawed because it was prompted by comments made by Brian Kelly, saying that he ultimately decided to leave Notre Dame for a place where he had the resources to win a national championship. So the discussion of and I want to break down exactly what Brian Kelly meant there and exactly what that reflects on LSU, but I believe the discussion after Brian Kelly made those remarks are a little off base. Is it easier to win a national title at Notre Dame or at LSU? Well, that's an incredibly flawed argument because, first of all, winning a national title isn't easy anywhere. Whatever the Nick Sabans and the Alabamas of the world have showed you over this past, decade of dominance of Alabama football, it's not easy to win a national title anywhere. But you look at Notre Dame's schedule, and they play Boston College and Marshall and Syracuse. And you look at LSU's schedule, and year in and year out, they're playing Alabama, Texas A&M, Auburn, Florida, Ole Miss, some of the best teams in the country. LSU competes in the most difficult division, in the most competitive conference in all of college football. So that's nothing that you don't know already, but it just goes to show that calling a national championship easy to win at LSU, just because there may be more resources, isn't necessarily fair. But it's that exact word of resources that Brian Kelly cites as the motivating factor as to why he wanted to move on from Notre Dame and on to LSU. And what I really think he means by that is a few things. Now, we understand that from Brian Kelly's time at Notre Dame, he was really campaigning for two things, both for all student athletes and really for football. I mean, let's be honest here. He wanted to have the best resources and the best things available for his football team. And both of those things are things that LSU has. Well, I just fell off my chair. LSU has both of those things, and they have state-of-the-art things. The first thing that Brian Kelly was really campaigning for at Notre Dame was a football chef and a nutrition center for the football players, which could be accessible to all student athletes, as he stated, accessible to all student athletes, but a specialized football chef at Notre Dame. And you may say, well, that sounds like a silly reason to move to another team. A lot of reasons behind that, but I think the nutrition center is so incredibly important because it's something that is state-of-the-art at LSU. And I cite an article that I read about Aaron Donald, for example, one of the best, if not the best player in the NFL, offensive or defensively. And when Aaron Donald first got into the league, he kind of struggled. He it was difficult for him to make it through games. His production went down from his time at Pitt to his time in the NFL. And he was wondering why that was the case. Well, it's because in his time at Pitt, he had nutritionists. He had people who were making his food and creating this meal plan, and he was getting the right nutrients. And whenever he went into the NFL, he no longer had that. So he couldn't make it through games because he just wasn't fueled enough. And when he hired a personal chef and when he hired a nutritional team to be able to calculate exactly what he needed to be eating on a daily basis in order to produce at the level that he is in the National Football League, that's when it really made a difference for him, when he was able to really break out and become dominant. That's it. That's an overwhelming advantage that LSU has, or any team with a football chef, with nutritionists, with a center that's incredibly easy for student athletes and football players to go and get whatever food that they need. It's incredibly important. And, Aaron Donald, for example, couldn't even make it through games. And the difference between that and being one of the best players in the league was hiring a nutritionist. So I really do think that might be kind of an underrated reason to look at LSU and say that place could be more competitive, because they just have more resources, nutritionists included. They just have more resources available for them. Another thing that Brian Kelly wanted to campaign for at Notre Dame was a new practice facility, new football facilities. And although Notre Dame was a little bit more on board with the nutritional side of things, building new facilities would have taken a very long time. And especially in this new age, this new era of college football, where recruiting has just gotten that much harder in the age of NIL, that not having state-of-the-art facilities in football, if you're getting recruited at Notre Dame, you're probably getting recruited at Clemson, at Alabama, at USC, at Arizona State, with some of these schools that have some of the nicest facilities in the country. If Notre Dame didn't have that now, it would take several years to get the money from boosters to be able to build those things, and also just to physically build those things up. So I think that Brian Kelly, two things that he wanted at Notre Dame, he had some of the nicest things at LSU. And so, yeah, those are resources to win a national championship, because it's a recruiting tool. It makes the lives of football players easier whenever they have all of the resources at their disposal. And having those state-of-the-art facilities already built up and already established is huge in recruiting. It's huge in training your current athletes, and it's huge in bringing that football team forward. But I also look at other, may not fall under the resources category, and back to the question of, is it easier to win a national championship at LSU or at Notre Dame? I don't like using the word easier, but I do think that there are two things that LSU has in their favor over Notre Dame. Notre Dame is an incredibly difficult academic school to get into. It's the threshold for GPAs and for test scores is much higher than it is at LSU or at several other schools in the SEC, some excluded. But that's a hurdle that a lot of student athletes have to go through, both entering college and throughout college, while they're in college, is maintaining a certain level of GPA. And that's much higher at Notre Dame. Another thing is simply the location of LSU. Louisiana produces some of the best football players in the country. And if those football players don't come from Louisiana, they come from bordering states or states very nearby, whether that be Mississippi or Texas or Florida or Alabama or the Carolinas. LSU is a much more attractive place for some of those best football players in the country to go to, rather than middle of nowhere, snowy, cold Indiana. So everyone is not everyone, I believe that a lot of outside of LSU, especially Notre Dame fans, but a lot of college football fans in general, are kind of throwing Brian Kelly under the bus and really critiquing those comments. But when you really break it down, he's not wrong. Albeit, I'm not going to say that LSU is an easier school to win a national championship at, because they have a much more difficult schedule. LSU has the resources to build a national championship program. So while I'm incredibly biased, I don't blame Brian Kelly for making those comments. Now, coming up next, LSU baseball with a huge sweep over Mississippi State. It was absolutely needed this past weekend. Who was hot that weekend and what we could look forward to in the future. We'll get into that coming up next. But before we do that, I want to let you know about Bet Online. And Bet Online is your number one source for all of your betting stats and sports information. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. I know that betting on baseball this early in the season is really difficult just because your starting pitching isn't really established yet. I always say that I try and hold off on betting on Major League Baseball until like after Memorial Day, whenever all of their bullpen and their lineups and their rosters are completely set. But I have been using betonline.net a lot to kind of get all of my news about the MLB and see who's emerging as the hot offensive teams, who's emerging as some of the better pitching teams in the country. So betonline.net has made my ease into the baseball season much, much easier. Plus, it's your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. We're getting very close to the NBA playoffs, so make sure to check out BetOnline if you want to put some basketball bets down there. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now, a big announcement, people. Drum roll. Starting Thursday, April 28th, tune in to Locked On NFL Draft's live coverage of the 2022 NFL Draft with all 3 days of real-time analysis from our extensive lineup of experts and insiders. And for those of you dying to know who your team will take, catch Odyssey and Locked On's NFL Mock Draft special hosted by Brian Peacock and former scout Matt Williamson of the Peacock and Williamson NFL show all week leading up to the first pick. Where you can find it. Locked On NFL Draft Live will be on the Locked On NFL Draft YouTube page, so make sure to check that out. Give that a subscribe as well. You can also find it on Odyssey's NFL Mock Drafts on the Odyssey and NFL Draft podcast feeds. When is it going to be? April 28th, that Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern, April 29th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, and April 30th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. The Odyssey NFL Mock Draft is April 18th through the 22nd and also the 25th. So make sure to give that a listen as well. So LSU baseball, a much, much needed big weekend from LSU baseball, sweeping Mississippi State, the reigning College World Series champions. Fun little fact. This was LSU's first SEC sweep since March 2019 when they swept Kentucky at home. And I know, take that with a little bit of a grain of salt because they didn't play SEC games in the 2022 season, but that's a pretty crazy stat. That was the first SEC sweep since March 2019, so big time there. Sweeping Mississippi State improves LSU baseball to 23-9 on the season, 7-5 in the SEC, getting that above 500 win column for LSU is that the first time? No, it's not the first time. But for the first time in a couple of weeks. Second, they're now sitting at second in the West behind Arkansas, who's sitting at 8-4 in the SEC. Coincidentally enough, that's LSU's opponent this weekend. They have a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday series against Arkansas. So kind of a tight race there between Arkansas and LSU for that top spot in the SEC West. So crunch time, big time series against Arkansas this weekend, who is looking red hot, by the way. But speaking of red hot, some of the hottest players that I saw from this weekend, and Sunday was an absolute hit parade, defeating Mississippi State 13-3 on the weekend, completing the sweep there. And I thought that was a huge, huge statement win on Sunday, continuing the momentum throughout the weekend, because it could be easy to kind of fall off knowing you already got the series win, maybe take your foot off the gas a little bit, but that is not what LSU did by any means. My first hot player was the relief pitcher Grant Taylor, who just absolutely lit it up in relief of Samuel Dutton on Sunday. He pitched 4 innings on Sunday, had allowed 2 runs, 5 hits, walked 0 batters, struck 6 of them out. And I mentioned Samuel Dutton, and he is another hot player for the weekend. He did a great job on Sunday, starting 3 inning pitched, not the longevity that you'd really want to see or expect to see from your starting pitcher, but it's still early, and he'll build up to it. But 3 innings pitched, allowed 1 run, 4 hits, no walks again, only 1 strikeout, but again, I do think that there's a lot of room for improvement there. But my hottest player of the weekend was right fielder Josh Pearson. Oh my goodness. On Sunday, throughout the weekend, and throughout the whole entire week, his bat has been electric. He had 2 homers on Sunday, 5 RBIs, and 2 runs in the series and on the week, including that game against Grambling on Tuesday night. He improved to 6-13 on the week. Josh Pearson had an absolutely lights out game on Sunday. And if you watch that game, it was pretty neck and neck. It was a tie game through the 5th inning, or until the 5th inning. And then that 5th inning is when Josh Pearson started to really rake some runs in. And that's where LSU got their momentum going. The offense started to electrify there, all from that catalyst of Josh Pearson. And he's gotten the accolades and the recognition for that weekend. He was named SEC co-freshman of the week. Also, Blake Purnell of Florida, that other co-freshman of the week. But Josh Pearson proving himself, certified slugger on Sunday. And I think that's the most impressive thing from this team is it's not a top-heavy offensive team. There are guys throughout the lineup that can really do things electric on offense. And also, one thing that I've had so many issues with is this defense. And I think that's been the reason why LSU has been losing so many of these games that they really shouldn't have. Dropping a series to Auburn, which they have no business doing as a top 20 team in the country, is losing a series to a team that wasn't even ranked. But on Sunday, 0 errors. 0 errors on Sunday. So round of applause for LSU baseball there. That is something that Jay Johnson mentioned a couple weeks ago was, that's where we have to focus. That's where we have to improve. And we're seeing a little bit of improvement there. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully, with this LSU baseball defense, but a big sweep over Mississippi State over the weekend. Now, they had a midweek game scheduled against Lamar on Tuesday night. That will be postponed due to weather, most likely made up in the end of the season. But what we have to look forward to with LSU baseball, that series against Arkansas and a series win there would catapult them to that top spot in the SEC West. So we'll keep an eye on that. We'll have a full Thursday night game breakdown on Friday's show as well. But coming up next, a couple of stories involving LSU sports that you may have missed over the weekend that I think you're really going to enjoy. I'll get into that coming up next. But before we do that, just a few words from our friends over at our sponsors. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And coming up on tomorrow's show, it is Mailbag Wednesday. So if you have a question, a comment, something that you'd like me to discuss on tomorrow's show, make sure to send those questions, comments, whatever it may be. And you can DM them to me on Twitter. You can tweet them to me at Caroline Fenton 1 or at Locked On LSU. So we'll take a look at your questions tomorrow. Also, we'll take a look at exactly the direction that spring football practice is going, kind of Brian Kelly's plan, his outlook for the rest of the spring, and also what another college football coach had to say and why it could be a good thing and why it is even relevant to LSU football fans. That will be on the docket on tomorrow's show. But like I said, 2 major stories that may have gotten brushed under the rug a little bit that relate to LSU sports that I think would be really interesting to LSU fans. Now, to start on a little bit of a more somber note, we'll take it back to 2018. Wade Sims, an LSU basketball player, was tragically killed at a fraternity party. He was in a verbal altercation, and a man pulled out a gun and shot and killed Wade Sims. It was such a tragic moment for that team, the student body, for LSU sports fans as a whole, just incredibly, just awful. And I think that especially, too, with the news over the weekend of Steelers quarterback Dwayne Haskins passing away, is just constant reminders of how, first of all, athletes are humans and just how precious life really can be. So Wade Sims, the trial for his murder happened yesterday, on Monday, and he was found guilty. So the man who shot and killed Wade Sims will serve time for that. So you hate the circumstances that it falls under, but you like to see that justice is served there. But I think that the most important aspect there was the fact that Will Wade came to the trial to be with Wade Sims' family and his father, Wayne Sims. Incredibly touching to see that from Will Wade, the fact that he didn't have to do that at all. He's a guy who probably wants to stay out of the spotlight, but he chose to be there for Wade Sims' family. And I think that is such a wonderful feather in Will Wade's cap, that he just really loved those players. And I know there's been a lot of negative discussion surrounding Will Wade, both in the LSU communities and also sports fans communities alike. Kind of questioning the integrity and the type of person that Will Wade is. But I think that it's a wonderful reminder of just how much Will Wade loved LSU and loved his players and cared about his players on more of a personal level. The fact that he was there to be able to support Wade Sims' family. So thoughts and prayers to Wade Sims' family and his friends, and hoping that they can sleep a little bit better at night knowing that the man who did this is behind bars. On a little bit more positive note, Seimone Augustus, who is the LSU's most decorated female athlete to date. No other LSU women's basketball player has really impacted more than Seimone Augustus has. But it was announced on Monday that there will be a statue of Seimone Augustus erected outside of the PMAC. So she will join Shaquille O'Neal, Pete Maravich, and Bob Pettit outside of the PMAC. She is the first female to have a statue at LSU. So such a wonderful, wonderful accolade for Seimone Augustus. I mean, you look at what she's been able to do for this. She led them to 3 consecutive Final Four appearances, was named National Player of the Year and SEC Player of the Year both twice. She's a 2-time recipient of the Wooden Award and the Honda Award, the 2 most prestigious honors in women's basketball, both given to Seimone Augustus. So congratulations to Seimone Augustus, and I'm really, really excited to see some female athletes getting some recognition on campus. So that is going to do it for me today. Appreciate you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL Draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It's going to be really nice, especially we're getting into draft season. So check it out. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. I'll see y'all tomorrow.